Okay, this morning we're going to talk about what can you believe. And I've been very busy at work this week. The last couple of weeks I'm involved in a case where we've had to produce literally hundreds of thousands of documents in a very short time frame and review those. So that takes a lot of time to go through. Lots and lots of boring spreadsheets and that type of thing. So if it appears I'm scrambling just a tad today, I think there's a good reason for it. We talk each week about the convergence of events. One of the ones that I'm going to talk about at the end relates to something that happened. You see the slide there with the burning temple. That happened on Tish B'Av in 70 AD. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and that's when the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple and sacked Jerusalem and carried off the temple treasures to Rome, and that's memorialized in the Arch of Titus. But I'll finish up with that today. So today I'm talking about what can you believe, and it is a time when it is becoming increasingly difficult to believe things. I think we saw an example of that this week. Let me share a couple verses with you. Now, I have never been one that's big on conspiracy theories, and partly because we'll talk about this in just a moment. There's a conspiracy theory about everything, and it quickly descends into a very confusing morass. I'm a trial lawyer. I am evidence-based. I spend a lot of time looking for evidence. And I think what happens a lot in the world today is that people come to a conclusion first, then they spend all their time gathering facts that support only the conclusion that they've already come to. And this happens on geopolitics, it happens on social issues, it happens on even on theological issues. And I prefer to find out, for example, I really want, and look, I'm guilty of it too, I want to find out what does the Word of God say. And there are some warnings in Isaiah about conspiracy theories. Isaiah chapter 8, verse 10, "Oh, take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand. For God is with us. For the Lord spake thus to me with a strong hand, and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, say ye not a confederacy. To all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy, neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid. Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread." In the ESV, it talks about, do not call a conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy. Now, I know that this was written by Isaiah, who was a prophet to the northern kingdom, and that, John, you shouldn't cite the Old Testament because that has nothing to do with us. But the principle, I think, is valid and important, that we kind of delve off into everything. So let me just give you one little interesting news clip, and then I'll talk more about this conspiracy theory thing. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal yesterday. Now, what's interesting is that over the past month, in their Saturday sections, the Wall Street Journal has been flagging certain things that people that look at Bible prophecy and the events in the world are looking at. A few weeks ago, they had a thing about asteroids, that there are asteroids coming. It appears that there are asteroids coming. We don't know when or where they will hit or if, but to the extent that they do, there's nothing we can do to stop it. One of the other things, so yesterday's Wall Street Journal, on the Saturday leisure section, they talk about volcanoes. Volcano threats are hiding in plain sight. And their point is that there's a lot of talk about the volcanic activity under Yellowstone National Park, one of the largest cauldrons in the world, if not the largest in the world. And what happens if that blows? And what happens if that blows is the United States is a goner. I just don't think there's any question about that. But the Wall Street, in this article, says, and I think it's a valid point, rather than worrying about Yellowstone, we have all these volcanic mountains in the western mountain ranges of the United States that are much more active and much more of a real threat. So if you live out on the West Coast, that's probably not so good news for you. I've hardly coughed all morning until I get up here. It used to be the opposite. This article in this morning's New York Times review section, are we living in a computer simulation? Now, sometimes it would be great to say, yeah, we are living in a computer simulation and we can get rid of all these problems just by rebooting everything. But what's happening is as science drills down more and more into the nature of reality and what's going on, it becomes a very esoteric and confusing morass that they're getting into. And I think this is why some scientists who have tried to come up with this ultimate theory of everything have failed and fell off into mysticism. For example, if you look at some of the later writings of Sir Isaac Newton that his family has and that people I know have been able to review, he really, in the his latter years, delved off into sort of a very troubling form of mysticism. And this is where a lot of scientists end up. And so this article today says, a lot of scientists, physicists are looking at this and they're saying, this whole thing doesn't even, I'm not even sure that reality is really real. It might be an illusion or a giant computer simulation. And this plays into, I think, what's going on is that people are having more and more trouble figuring out what's real and what to believe. Here's a video that I found, somebody sent me, called Living Portraits. I'll play, it has about a 30-second clip, and I'll make some comments on what comes up at the end.
We present a system that can learn realistic talking head models. Notably, learning of a new head model requires just a handful of images. In this example, the model was learned from 8 frames. Once a talking head model was learned, it can be driven by the positions of the face landmarks. In this case, we extract landmarks by running an off-the-shelf face landmark tracker on a different video of the same person.
So what they did there was they took 2 videos of the same person. It learned what their facial expressions look like, and now they're able to generate, through voice technology and that type of thing, fake videos. Here's some videos from Living Portraits. That was Marilyn Monroe. Here's Salvador Dali. And you can see what they've been able to do. They take somebody who's talking and they transpose them, or they make them into somebody else. Here's Albert Einstein. And these look very real. Now, sometimes people say, oh, well, we can figure that's a fake because they're not, the blink rate of the eyes is not correct. They're even taking portraits, artist portraits, and turning them into videos. Here's somebody that's done something with the Mona Lisa. Now, what happens with this, though, is it becomes very, if you think life is confusing right now, and it's difficult to figure out what is real, I'm telling you that this is off-the-shelf software. This is software that anybody can get and use. What do you think this next election season is going to be like if people use this kind of technology? We already have a problem with what I consider to be, and again, I'll make a disclaimer. I may refer to somebody. That doesn't mean I support everything that somebody says. I may refer to President Trump. That doesn't mean I support everything that President Trump does, says, tweets, or whatever. But there have been lies told about President Trump. One of them is, and I showed you the cover of Newsweek magazine last week, the current issue of Newsweek magazine, well, I guess it was last week's issue of Newsweek magazine, that shows, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, skinheads, and that sort of thing. And then President Trump sort of superimposed over them saying, very fine people. He never said that. It is a big, fat lie. Joe Biden started his campaign based on that lie. Dennis Prager at Prager University, they have a CNN contributor who has come out with a video just this past week that says this, and he goes through and shows what President Trump actually said after Charlottesville. But what happens? The media completely spins everything into this lie. I don't want him doing that about Joe Biden. You don't have to do that about Joe Biden because he says enough nutty stuff on his own without any help. Same way with Kamala Harris or any of the other Democratic candidates. I want to know what they said. I don't want the media to make it up. But we live in this time where, with this type of technology and that sort of thing, it's going to become increasingly difficult. Now, I believe this is very, very prophetic. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus warned about deception in the end times more than anything else. More than earthquakes, famines, wars, rumors of wars. 4 times he warned about deception. Take heed that no man deceive you. Because there is coming a time when deception will be rampant. We know from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 that it says in the latter part of that chapter that God sends them strong delusion so that they will believe the lie. Your anchor, and by the way, Pastor Steve, go listen to Pastor Steve's sermon from First Hour. It was fantastic. I wholly support everything that he said in that. The anchor is the Word of God and Jesus Christ. And it's going to become increasingly difficult. And an example for this will be what happened, and I'll say what some people say happened and what people say allegedly happened in Manhattan yesterday at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Jeffrey Epstein, it's reported, committed suicide. So I posted that on my Facebook page, and immediately everybody has all kinds of different theories. One is he did commit suicide. 2 is he was killed. 3 is he was killed by a certain political family in the United States that has enormous power, even though they haven't won an election in 20 years, roughly. Well, I guess not. She won an election for Senate, but I think you know who I'm talking about. But she didn't win the presidency the last time. She lost the Electoral College. And so that's theory number 2 or 3. 2, and I got 2A and 2B. 3 would be he was not killed. They found a homeless person. They substituted the body, and Epstein has been moved to a private island as a reward for spilling the beans on everybody, and so he won't have to he won't have to face the death penalty. Now, he's never been charged with anything, and I've never seen anything in any of the current indictment against him that would result in him receiving the death penalty. But again, people just say, well, he did this. He's being given a gift, or some say he was suicided because it was a gift. It was better to kill him now than have him face the death penalty later. But what happens is, the answer is, what happened in Manhattan yesterday? And the answer is, we don't know. Now, I personally think he's dead. And if he is dead, he took a lot of secrets with him. And it will be difficult to prosecute people. But look, the allegations against Jeffrey Epstein go back 15 years at least. Most people broke with him 10 or 12 years ago when he entered into a plea agreement with regard to charges that were made against him. And nothing's been done in the interim. Now, people have pressed, there's some David Boies and others are representing people suing Epstein, And they've pushed, and now that sort of led the Justice Department to bring charges against him for human trafficking, sex trafficking, or trafficking young females for sex. So he was denied bail. He was in the MCC. It's a federal institution. It's a jail in Manhattan. I'm pretty sure it's downtown near the courthouse. And he's apparently gone. And everybody's looking, and now everybody's an amateur forensic analyst now, and they look at the photographs and, well, it doesn't look like him, and this earlobe is a little bit different. And if he died, he died by hanging, which is somewhat of a violent death, so it might alter some of his physical appearance. But nobody knows what happened. It's front page news all over the world today that this guy is dead. And some of the things I've read, I've started looking through some of the documents from the civil case that I think failed. I think they lost on summary judgment. But some of the documents were released by a federal judge, and they hit the internet on Friday. They're not complete set of documents about allegations against Jeffrey Epstein, but it's clear that this guy was a con man. He was evil. A local rich person, Les Wexner, founder of L Brands, Victoria's Secret, Bath and Body Works, lives just down the road here. And he came out and said, Epstein stole $46 million from my family. Now, to someone who's worth $7 billion, $46 million is really pocket change. It's still a lot of money, but it's not. Mr. Wexner didn't have to sell his house or his country club that he built or anything like that. But there's other reports. Epstein was involved in a Ponzi scheme, and a guy that he worked with went to prison for 18 years. He said Epstein was the guy who was the mastermind. But if you go back to court documents now, Epstein's not really even mentioned. And it's pretty clear that he was involved in this, and the guy did 18 years in prison. So what happened exactly in Manhattan? Just everybody calm down and wait, and we'll see what happens. But it shows, I think, the world that we live in right now, where you can't sit and take time to analyze everything. You have to come up with an immediate response or story or theory about what happened. Now, I don't work that way as a lawyer. I prefer to gather my evidence and look through it and consider the bad evidence and the good evidence when I'm putting a case together, and not just cherry pick everything that supports my particular theory. So look, there are evil people in this world. There are evil people that are far more powerful than Bill and Hillary Clinton. They are trying to control things. And I think at some point in time, God will pull back whatever hand of protection that he has, and they will be given a very short season in which to try to put together their plan to control everything. And we know how it ends. It ends when the King, Messiah, returns and takes care of it. So in the end, I know how it ends up. That doesn't mean it won't be very troubling times up until then, but I know the end result. And I know that we have a mission of things that we're supposed to do in the interim. But until then, it's going to be very disruptive. And a point I often make is, I know there's been these powerful people that have been trying to do this, and they've been at it for hundreds of years. And my personal opinion is they're not very good at it. Try as they might, they just never have seemed to be able to get their one world order in place. Eventually, I think they will have a short season in which they will. And I'm ready for that. But I just think that, look, there are evil people. And I think there's persecution coming for Christians. I think there's persecution coming for Christians in America. I think there's going to be increasing attacks on Christians and Jews worldwide. This seems to be the pattern. As one person says, that first they're coming for the The Sunday people, then they'll get the Saturday people. It means they'll get the Christians first and then the Jews. And we live in a world that is just, it seems like it's falling apart. I don't even have time to play you videos of all the different things that are going on. For example, there are these protests going on in Hong Kong. And this is an example. Immediately somebody says, oh, well, all those protests in Hong Kong they're caused by the CIA because the CIA opposes China. Well, I hope the CIA opposes China, frankly. I'm not sure that they're doing this, but I think people in Hong Kong are pretty intelligent people, and they know what's coming on them if China implements some of the things that China wants to implement, and they're concerned about their freedom. So they're protesting. But just waving it off as, oh, that's a CIA plot, I think really diminishes why those people are out there protesting at great risk to themselves. But it goes to show you that, for example, the reports of the news were that Chinese troops, crack paramilitary Chinese troops, were massing on the border of Hong Kong. And immediately I saw people posting, oh, wait a minute, there's no border. Hong Kong is an island. So I thought, well, I would get a map of Hong Kong, and part of Hong Kong is an island. It's called Hong Kong Island. But you can see on the map that the rest of Hong Kong is not an island. It's part of a peninsula. And there's a Chinese border up there by Guangdong, Shenzhen. And so there is a border that troops can mass on. But again, it goes to show you what happens is people say, well, I heard that Hong Kong was an island. And therefore, when somebody says there's troops bordering on, massing on the border, they immediately say, well, that's wrong. That can't be true because Hong Kong's an island. It doesn't have a border. But it does have a border. But do you see, and then I see people retweeting that or repeating that. It's just not true. Everybody needs to be careful about what they put out there. That's my opinion. In India and Pakistan are on the verge of war. They are nuclear powers. They don't like each other. Up in the Kashmir region of India, there's been sort of a joint, it was called Article 370. The nationalist, pro-Hindu new president, Modi, or current Prime Minister of India, I think he just got reelected. And he's very pro-Hindu, and Hindus are running around persecuting Christians. Pastor Steve, am I right on that? That there's a tremendous persecution of Christians going on in India today by Hindus. Now that doesn't compute. But up in Kashmir is where the Hindus and the Muslims sort of intersect. And it's a very tenuous relationship. I believe after the partition of India back in 1947-48, over 2 million people died in that region. It has long been an area of conflict between Muslims and Hindus. Historical records show, and I think these are accurate, that somewhere around 80 to 100 million Hindus were killed by Muslims in that region in the past. I would suspect that many people don't know that. So it is, and they're both nuclear powers. And what's going to happen, nobody knows. It's very tense. India has completely shut down that region, cut off all telecommunications. Big article in the New York Times talking to some people in Kashmir, and they say, it's a living hell here now. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if we're going to have food. We don't have outside communications with the world. What's going to happen to us? And it's a very it's a heavily populated region. And so that's just two examples of all these conflicts going on in the world. I could talk about Sudan. I could talk about Libya. I could talk about some of the things going on in Africa. I have friends from South Africa who write me all the time and say, it's unbelievable what's happening here. And the government doesn't seem willing to step in to stop it. Farmers are being murdered. And then if you mention it, Somebody will say, oh, you're just a conspiracy theorist, Haller. That's not really what's happening. That's just a conspiracy theory. So Epstein is one of it. Now, I'm going to just give you a sort of a brief overview of this. An example of this is the Gatestone Institute and some of the things that it reports. Now, I find the Gatestone Institute to be highly credible. Their articles, as I go through and research something to talk about here on Sunday, if I refer to them, they have more links in their articles than any other website that I've seen in recent memory. Their authors are meticulous as to the way they make their case. And one of the things that they're talking about right now is France slowly sinking into chaos. Now, when you bring that up, people will say, oh, Haller, you're just into conspiracy theories. France is not that bad. I was just in Paris. It was okay. But underneath, there's a lot of turmoil in France. This week marked the 39th consecutive week of the Yellow Vest protests that are taking place. Now, among the Yellow Vests are some pretty nasty people. People that are very anti-Semitic, anti-Jew, white supremacists. But then there are, I'll say, there are some very fine people. With the risk that somebody will take that out of context and say, so right here, get it clear. John Haller does not believe that everybody involved in the Yellow Vest protests is a very fine people or person, okay? I don't. But there are people who are concerned about the loss of their freedoms and what's happening to France. This is an article from July 8th, 2019 by Jonathan Turley. He is a left-wing professor. You've probably seen him on Fox and CNN. He's a man of the left, but I would call him more of a liberal than a leftist, sort of like Alan Dershowitz. But his politics lean to the left side of the spectrum. But he says this: France emerges as one of the world's greatest threats to free speech. Now, this is one of the articles cited in the Gatestone Institute article, France Descending into Chaos. And what he talks about in there is that it is France is restricting speech in many respects. There were also other articles talking about this and so what the Europeans are doing is they are instituting hate speech laws, restrictions on free speech. And these have enormous fines, maybe up to 4% of a company's annual revenue, which in the case of a Facebook or Twitter is an enormous amount of money. And so they know that if they can enact laws and Facebook and Twitter fall into line with our restrictions, do you think Facebook and Twitter are going to distinguish between, okay, well, we only do this and we restrict things here in France, but in the United States, we'll respect free speech? A corporation, and so what the governments are doing is, for example, here, we have a constitutional amendment protecting free speech. So what is happening is Germany and France are enacting these hate speech codes with the result that Twitter or Facebook will take the path of least resistance, and they will restrict free speech everywhere based on what they are prohibited from doing in Europe. And so the Europeans know that this is what's going to happen, so they're putting in these restrictive codes. In the United States, we would call this the California exception. California always enacts things like very restrictive emissions controls on cars. And so what the car companies do, because California is such a big market, is they eventually just adopt those restrictions nationwide rather than make cars for California and cars for the rest of the country. And so the most restrictive state wins. It's going to be the same thing when we get to some free speech codes, gun laws, and that type of thing as we go down the road. So, as this article says, Macron knows the European speech controls are likely to metastasize throughout the internet. They have already laid waste to free speech in Europe. These laws criminalize speech under vague standards referring to inciting or intimidating others based on race or religion. For example, fashion designer John Galliano has been found guilty in a French court on charges of making anti-Semitic comments against at least 3 people in a Paris bar. At his sentencing, Judge Anna Maria Sauterad read out a list of bad words used by Galliano to Geraldine Block and Philip Vergetti. He said dirty whore at least 1,000 times, she explained out loud. The result of such poorly defined laws is predictable. A recent poll found only 18% of Germans feel they can speak freely in public. And 35% said free speech is confined to small private circles. That is called a chilling effect, and it should be feared. And it's similar to what Juan Castro did when he released contributors to Trump's campaign from his district. He was doing it so people would go harass them. There were people threatening Mitch McConnell at his home in Washington, D.C. He put a video up of it on Twitter, and Twitter took it down because it involved threats. But it was the guy who was being threatened who put it up that was like, see what they're doing to me? But Twitter couldn't bear that it is insanity. So we're seeing this increasing censorship taking place. I mentioned this a few weeks ago. There's a draft bill that's been enacted in France. They give social media platform, partially in France, it's not all the way through, gives social media platforms 24 hours to remove hateful content or risk fines up to 4% of their global revenue. There are other reports. These were things that were enacted last year and also earlier this year by people in the assembly in France. And the one lady, she's racially, she's black, and she's been insulted. I mean, some of the things have been said about her on social media are horrible. They're just awful. So what she's doing is she's pushing through these codes, these speech codes, to stop everybody from saying anything negative or perceived to be negative about anybody else. And it all becomes very Orwellian very quickly. Macron, this is from last year, had a plan where he's trying to make Islam French, a French version of Islam. How do you think that's going to go? And so it's just not going to work. So there's, this is from the article, this is from the French translation. The head of state should soon give his vision of the place of the second religion of France. There's an urgency to delay on the subject of relations between Islam and the Republic. Macron wanted to give himself time. Since his election, he has always refused to react in the urgency of a crisis. The moment is approaching. And so in these, what they're finding is, and the Gatestar article talks about this, about the collapse of France, is that the yellow vests come out and the police come out, and I've seen the videos. They shoot off hands, they fracture skulls, permanently brain damaging people, and then they clear up the yellow vest protests, and then here come the Antifa types, and nothing happens to them. And then the Muslim youths come, and nothing happens to them. And so Macron has become this sort of very totalitarian guy. So that's just sort of an example of what's, I think, coming almost everywhere. Now, there are people standing up against this, but if you stand up against it, you're immediately labeled a conspiracy theorist or something. Other things that are happening in the world is, and again, yeah, I do cite the New York Times. I think it's an important newspaper, and I don't agree with everything. There's a way to read it, to extract facts out of it, just like there's a way to extract facts out of almost everything. But they do make some good points every now and then, and this week they've had some things on the environment. There was a big article about a coming crisis in food, that food production is under stress in many areas of the world. And if you live here in Ohio, drive around Ohio, and you can see we have a big problem this year in terms of crops. Some look okay, but I've never seen, especially near the middle of August, soybeans look like this. I mean, just down the road, some of these, they look pathetic. That's going to have a big impact. That ripples through the economy like you wouldn't believe. One of the other things that the New York Times pointed out the day before the article on the food crisis was the water stress in the world. Qatar is the most stressed country in the world, water-wise. Number 2, Israel. Number 3, I believe, is Jordan. This is affecting geopolitics in the Middle East. We know that there seems to be a focus in the end times. Scripture focuses on the Middle East. Take a look at the world map. Where does it seem that the water stress is focused? A lot of these areas where you're seeing conflicts and everything right now. Turkey is notorious. They're building dams in Turkey. They have a lot of water. They've been referred to as the OPEC of water. And one of their leaders, I don't think it was Erdogan, I think it was a prior leader, when Syria and Iraq and other countries downriver, because they have the Euphrates River and in going through Turkey, and they have a huge dam there. And when the oil-rich countries were saying, "What are you're making us die of thirst?" The leader of Turkey said, "Well, drink your oil." So this is a huge problem. But I'm just saying it's one of these converging things that we see. We see the acts of violence in the United States. These are some pictures from Dayton, Ohio, downtown Dayton, just last Sunday, that we didn't have these pictures when I talked. Now, the way this is reported, the guy who did the Dayton shooting was clearly a supporter of Elizabeth Warren. He was a Satanist, but everybody just talks about, oh, it's white supremacy, and it's all Donald Trump's fault. That's what the narrative is in the media. The guy down in El Paso appeared to hate Hispanics, but he also was he was a big environmentalist. We have too many people, we got to get rid of some of them. They're stressing our resources. The New York Times last Monday evening released the Tuesday front page, and it referenced President Trump's speech where he talked about unity. He also suggested that he would support some of these red flag laws, which I think is a huge mistake because I have not seen one that's been drafted yet that could not end up with being abused by people, against people that they don't agree with politically. And that's a big concern. So I'm concerned that he came out for that. But you see here, Trump urges unity versus racism. So what was the response to this? The response to this was, from 4 of the Democratic candidates, was, New York Times, that's a horrible headline. That sort of implies that President Trump is trying to get over his, this problem with racism. So the New York Times, that headline lasted for about an hour. It was then changed, and this is what actually was published across most of the nation, assailing hate, but not guns. So if you look, and then the prior one, it was a national outcry over extremism. That was the sort of the subtitle. It became backlash to extremism pressures president. Now, headlines are not the story, but, well, they are here. They are the story because they're trying to push a particular narrative. So this is a problem. We have all sorts of things. Let me make one more comment about France. And I don't even have any slides on this, so because I didn't have time to get everything together with graphics this week. I have talked about demographics quite a bit. In France, there is a a big problem with demographics. Back in 2017, I believe it was, a gentleman named Gove wrote an article, and his article was called, I don't remember the title of it, but it's very good. And he talked about the demographics of France and where they're going. Now, listen, I talk about demographics a lot, almost every week lately, because there are certain things going on in the world demographically that lead me to conclude that we're closer than you think. Now, when you point out the demographics and you point out where it's going, the response to Mr. Gove's article was, and Gove is he works for a financial analyst firm or a financial services firm, and he's just saying is, look, I'm not saying whether the demographics of France are good or bad. I'm just saying this is the way it is. This is what's going to happen. There's no way to change this. And we see certain of these demographic pressures. I've mentioned before, China will have 200 million more people over the age of 65 than they do today. Their population is going to decline over the next 40 years. And again, here's the disclaimer. Because I'm saying what's going to happen 40 years down the road does not mean that I think the Lord's not returning for another 40 years, okay? You got that through your head? What I'm saying is what the trend is, and my personal opinion is, with the way everything else is accelerating, demographic trends are going to hit the world much more quickly than even the experts think, because things are changing that rapidly. 1,000 more people die in Japan every day than are born. That's been going on for a couple of decades. Japan doesn't allow immigration. It's not sustainable. So I want to read a little bit from Gove's article, and he talks about, he makes some points. One more graphic, two more demographic things. The most rapidly aging country on the planet, Iran. That means if Iran's going to do what we think in Bible prophecy, it seems like they're coming into a very narrow window where they're going to have to act before they don't have the people to do it. Not the least of which is the fact that there's a bit of a revival going on. In fact, Joel Richardson on his Underground YouTube series, The Underground with Joel Richardson and Dalton Thomas, did a phenomenal video about some of the things going on in Iraq among the Kurdish people and Iranian people, and I think I would highly recommend that you go watch it. Russia has 140 million people now. They're on track to soon have 100 million. Analysts have said that the Russian army by 2030 will be over 50% Muslim. All of these things, so there are these trends, and I think they're just part of the convergence of events. But listen to what Gove says. For the first time in history, almost all European leaders do not have children. Mrs. Merkel, Mrs. May, Mr. Macron, the prime ministers of Italy, Sweden, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Ireland, none of them have children. Only the Belgian, who has just replaced the former Belgian prime minister, and the Spaniard have 2 each. That's never happened before in history. I keep reading, I read all of these reports, and all the time I keep reading. What's the word that I use a lot? Unprecedented. This is unprecedented. This weather event is unprecedented. That weather event is unprecedented. That demographic thing is unprecedented. Eventually, the unprecedenteds pile up into a pretty big pile. And you think, I think, we're closer than we think. Now, I'm not trying to be an alarmist or anything. I'm just trying to be a realist. My first remark, he says, is that I cannot help but think that the one who has no child does not have the same notion of the future as the one who has had it. For those who do not have children, the future is likely to end in the next election or when they die. After me, they think, the deluge. In Germany, 30% of women over 45 and 40% of those with university degrees are childless, and the fertility rate, the number of children per woman of local populations, excluding immigrants, is about 1.4. The situation is the same in Italy, Spain, Greece, and elsewhere. And it's not sustainable. Now, when he wrote this article, immediately there were articles that came out and say, he's a conspiracy theorist. He just hates Muslims. He doesn't understand. And they say, well, we don't have any statistics in France to show that the fertility rate is 1.4. It looks like it's 2.4 or 2.6. But what happens in France? It's the same way they cook the crime statistics in Sweden. You're not allowed to report births by ethnic or religion classes. So we just pour everybody into a big pot, and then if there is a problem with certain ethnic or religious groups, there's no statistics to support it. And they say, see, there's no statistics to support it. Well, there are no statistics to support it because you're not tracking it. What do you think we are, morons? And the answer is, yeah, because we're in power and you're not. We're technocrats. He says this, I'm not saying that it will be bad or that it will be good. I'm simply saying that it will be very different and will not necessarily have an influence on the political system. And so in 40 years at the latest, it is almost certain that the majority of the population will be of Muslim origin in Austria, Germany, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Holland, and France. Again, it's not a prediction, it's a calculation, and I'm not even asking for more new immigrants. I will not see the shift, but my children will probably see it, and certainly my grandchildren. What happened to Spain or Asia Minor in the 10th and 11th centuries will come to Europe in the 21st century. It is a certainty. Our elites congratulate each other every day on the pretext that our fertility rate per woman in France is about 2.2 children per woman, thus ensuring the replacement of generations, which is a very good thing. But they don't track that. And when they do track it, they find that the fertility rate among the French population is 1.4. That's way below replacement rate. Those of Muslim origin have a fertility rate of between 3.6 and 4. He says this, politicians live in a perpetual present, and to try to sell to their constituents the idea that they are able to stop time, that everyone will always remain young, and that this pleasant present will last forever, much like in the song, more than 1,000,000 years and always in summer. And that explains Emmanuel Macron. Very good article. So let's look at some geopolitics things as we wrap up here. And we'll look mostly at the Middle East. So Iran continues to try to do its things. It has come out, it's unveiled some new smart bombs. Rouhani gave a speech last week it seems like the people in Iran I see these big crowds sitting around all the time listening to the people doing speeches. And I think they don't have golf courses in Iran, I'm pretty sure. So maybe they do, I don't know. But it seems like that's all they have to do is sit around and listen to these really boring speeches. And so here's Rouhani's speech. He's talking, and really what he's saying is if the United States needs to change its path. The U.S. should repent. Our people believe, he says, what God says. Our people will accept it. If you really repent and regret, this is the true path. Last year I was talking to you and the ambassadors that peace with Iran is the mother of all peace. War with Iran would be the mother of all wars. And so this week there was a release of videos showing the new smart bombs that Iran has produced. They're under sanctions, so they're saying, well, we're just going to produce everything on our own. And so they're developing fairly sophisticated weapons. Now, sophisticated weapons carry a risk. There was a huge explosion at a Russian military installation, and they've had to evacuate people, and they admitted today that there were radioactive materials involved. And it appears it was one of the new hypersonic missiles that Russia has developed exploded in a test. And a couple of people died, a bunch of people were rushed to the hospital, and everybody was wearing radiation suits. They threw all the clothes out. But so this is, again, these are examples of Iranian smart bombs. People want peace. This is from the Arab News, showing that, well, the building of settlements is causing peace to be buried in the Middle East, Israeli settlements. It's always Israel. There was a report released by the Department of Defense, the Inspector General, to Congress just in the past week or so, called Operation Inherent Resolve. And what they do is they go through and they show that the situation in Syria and Iraq is, I don't know how else to describe it, it's pretty dire. We don't have the troops there to really do anything to prevent it. ISIS is reconstituting itself. The U.S. influence in that area is dwindling. Here are some of the key findings. Iraq and U.S.-backed Syrian forces struggle to contain ISIS insurgency. Increased threat from Iran prompts evacuation of U.S. personnel in Iraq. U.S. troop reductions change conditions in Syria. Thousands of ISIS supporters reside in Syrian camp with minimal security. Iraq's government fills top positions amid protest over lack of services. But why is that a problem? Because Iran is using its proxies. See, Iran knows they know their demographic. The leadership knows. That's why they're seating themselves among all the different. They're using these proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon and other places. Syria continues to be a problem. On the left is what Hamas Syria looked like on May 2nd, 2019. Less than 2 months later, on June 30th, 2019, is what that same area looked like after bombing took place. And this is cited in the Department of Defense report, Operation Inherent Resolve. There are a lot of divisions, especially in northwest Syria, the Kurds, and then one of the things that is happening here, and I'll get to it in just a minute, is Turkey is trying to reinsert itself. Two great articles in the Jerusalem Post. Iran thinks it can do whatever it wants by Seth Fransman, and then also below it, these are from Tuesday's Jerusalem Post. Islamic Republic has extended its reach to Israel's border, says Deputy Chief of Staff. With the subheading, the IDF officer claims no country in the region could win a ground war against Iran. And that's probably true. Iran is will be almost an impossible country for anyone to invade. But Seth Fransman's article, he just says, look, Iran, they seized another tanker, they do this, they do that, everybody says they're going to do something and nothing happens. And so Iran is concluding, we can pretty much do whatever we want. Seth says this, but the real message is that Iran can do what it wants, and there is no unrelenting response. In fact, there is little response. The U.S. has said that sanctions are breaking Iran and that it is facing relentless pressure. Iran says it faces economic terrorism and accuses the U.S. and UK as well as others of working against it. Iran is scrapping parts of the nuclear deal in response. But its real message is closer to home. Iran knows that no country has the stomach for a conflict with it, and most won't join a U.S. coalition in the Gulf. It also knows that the UK wants de-escalation with the Brexit crisis and that U.S. President Donald Trump does not want war. Tehran has read the American playbook and through its recent actions is attempting to assert power in the Persian Gulf. It's not a very optimistic article because Iran is a problem and it's causing problems on the world stage. And they know if they shut down production in the transfer of oil through the Straits of Hormuz, it will collapse the world economy. And they're okay with that. Why? Because they believe that world chaos will bring their Mahdi. So there's a religious component to it that a lot of people forget. But Seth, by the way, Seth Frantzman has written a book called After ISIS. He gave me an advanced copy of it. I'm not all the way through it. I will say that it's talking mainly about what ISIS did up among the Yazidi people in northwestern Iraq, Mosul, Nineveh, those areas. And all I can say is I would highly recommend, if you want to understand some of what's going on in that area, even today, that you read the book. I was trying to think of a clever way to review the book, and I would say this, that when you read it, you hope that it's just what you're reading is the product of a very evil mind that's creating very troubling fiction. But when you realize that what Seth Dunn has reported the facts in a very, very clear way, it's even more frightening than it would be if it was just fiction, because it's real life. So that book is Seth Frantzman. He's the op-ed editor for the Jerusalem Post, called After ISIS. The other article is Islamic Republic has extended its reach to Israel's borders, and that no country can stand up against it. And I would highly recommend it. Our defensive depth has stretched to the Mediterranean Sea, and our front has extended to the borders of the Zionist regime of Israel, said the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces. Today, Hezbollah and Hamas have gained great power and do not need our help anymore, and all of Israel's locations are within reach of the Lebanese Hezbollah. And this is disturbing. I mean, Israel is under a lot of pressure, and they're going through a big election. The English language newspaper in Lebanon is called the Lebanon Daily Star. And on Tuesday, or I think it was Wednesday, their edition was this. And then they had the next 2 pages: government deadlock, sectarian rhetoric increasing by the day. And every page was just like one line on each page. It concluded with the back page that said, "Wake up before it's too late." Because what they see is Lebanon is collapsing under this onslaught of Iranian influence and the growth of Hezbollah's influence. At the Begin Sadat Center Perspectives papers, there's a good paper by Yaakov Lapin, who writes about the Israel strategic goal in Syria. Now, you can go and you can download the article there, so I won't spend a lot of time going through that, but the executive summary is this: Israel's shadow war, and you need to put this in the context. I'm not going to go through all the scriptures that support this thing that's going to go on in northern Israel at some point. And we see the foundations of it beginning, but I don't know that it's at the final stage yet, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to be conflict. I mean, this is getting worse and worse. The executive summary: Israel's shadow war in Syria is based on the strategic objective of convincing the Islamic Republic that its investment in a war machine is going to waste. And Iran has so far chosen to weather the strikes and shift tactics without abandoning its Syria project. And they've shifted a lot of what they're doing, producing, over to Iraq. Now, Israel's having to attack Iraq. Now, back in June, the Mossad director, Yossi Cohen, spoke at the Herzliya conference. There's no audio for this, by the way. And he just said that essentially there was an attack on Israel back on June 1st, and then within hours, Cohen was speaking at this security conference in Herzliya, Israel, and he said, "I believe that Iran will reach the conclusion that it is just not worth it. In other words, we're just going to continue to chip away at them, and eventually they'll just go home. Now, I think this is I don't think this is going to change. They're building bases further away, and Cohen rightly notes that Israel's still going to attack them. The article, the paper by Mr. Lepine says this: Moscow's public stance appears to suggest that while Russia is open to pressuring Iran to stay away from the Israeli border, it either cannot or will not act to oust the Iranians and their proxies from Syria. The translation is, Persia is there to stay. Iran is there to stay. Iran's presence is still needed to stabilize the Assad regime, and the Iranians still have a strategic role to play in Russia's long-term Syrian project, despite the clear fractures and tensions that are emerging between Moscow and Tehran due to a divergence of interests in Syria. Israeli-Iranian competition over Russian influence looks set to continue, placing Moscow in the position of arbitrator in Syria, which shoots Russia's objective of returning to great power status in the Middle East. Crucially, he concludes, Israel has shown its determination to activate military force to keep Iran in check in Syria. This determination was expressed by Prime Minister Netanyahu on July 14th during a visit to the IDF National Defense College, where he said this: at the moment, the only military in the world that is fighting Iran is the Israeli military, and that's correct. But listen, this is, I think, a harbinger of the end times. Israel released this week a video of a new autonomous vehicle. It does have a crew of 2. It uses artificial intelligence. It looks kind of like a video game inside the cockpit of this thing. It's called the Carmel. It's a tank, and they've developed this. It's maybe the most advanced tank in the world. So if you want to see about that, there's a lot of video released to show people what its capabilities are. This week, let me just finish up with 2 things here. Here's a report from I-24 News. This week was the anniversary of the Sbarro pizza bombing in Jerusalem. It took place, I'm thinking about 2003. 16 people were killed, young people. Somebody walked into the Sbarro pizza parlor and blew themselves up. One of the masterminds of that was convicted. She was put in prison, but because of a prisoner swap with Hamas, she was released in 2011, and she now lives in Jordan. The United States has demanded her to be extradited to the United States to stand trial, and King Abdullah of Jordan refuses. He's made up some silly excuse that, well, I don't think our extradition treaty is clear enough. But here's a report from I-24 News about what the Palestinians have done, the Palestinian Authority has done, with the terrorists involved in this particular attack, and they've done this with terrorists in almost every other attack. They pay them.
A gaping hole left on the front of a pizzeria in the heart of Jerusalem after a Hamas suicide bombing claimed the lives of 15 civilians. Palestinian terrorists behind the massacre, on the other hand, filled up their pockets. 8 terrorists responsible for the Sbarro bombing have been paid almost $1 million by the Palestinian Authority over the past 18 years, according to a Palestinian Media Watch report. Ahlam Tamimi was the mastermind of the terror attack. Tamimi was sentenced to 16 consecutive life sentences, but was released in 2011 as part of the prisoner swap deal reached between Israel and Hamas. The PA paid her over $50,000 until her release. The bomb maker, Abdullah Barghouti, collected over $200,000 alone. Overall, more than $900,000 have been spent on Sbarro terrorists and their families, equaling to a monthly cost of $7,000. Dubbed as Pay for Slay, Palestinian Authority's Martyrs Fund is frequently criticized by Israel as an incentive to carry out attacks. Under the Trump administration, the Taylor Force Act came into law, cutting about a third of U.S. foreign aid payments to the PA until stipend payments to terrorists and their families are ceased.
This position of the Palestinian Authority, Mr. Chairman and ranking member, is inconsistent with the two-state solution. It's inconsistent with peace, and we need to stop our emboldening of the this practice.
This will affect me because I totally depend on the salary, the prisoner's salary. So if this salary is cut off, I have 7 children. How can we live? From where can I get money? Should I go begging?
It seems rather unlikely that the Palestinian Authority will budge. President Abbas claims the payments are a social responsibility. Thousands of Palestinians rely on them.
In an interview on ILTV this week, Dr. Martin Sherman was talking about what are we going to do about this Palestinian issue. Now, he has what I think a lot of people would consider an extreme view of how to deal with the situation. Many support the two-state solution. It's a big issue in the political race for the next Knesset and the prime minister that will come out of that. But Dr. Sherman's point was, listen, he in an article that he wrote, he said, listen, he attributed this quote to Einstein and said, this is what he said: we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And I think this has particular applicability to what's going on, because there's all this push. We got to have peace in the Middle East. We got to get this solved. We got to do a two-state solution. And the issue, and he says, listen, whether you like it or not, you either have Palestinians in Gaza or Jews in southern Israel. You can't have both with the way it's going. Eventually, all the Jews in southern Israel and the Negev will leave because they're under these rocket attacks. And it's just not worth it. So they'll leave and move. So you either have Palestinians living in Gaza or you have Jews living in Israel. But it would appear at this point you can't have both. And I can't say that he's wrong. And so the issue is, from a Bible prophecy perspective, is this seems to be a totally intractable problem. Turkey is also asserting itself. There was a meeting on Syria in Nur Sultan a little over a week ago. That used to be known as Astana, Kazakhstan. They renamed it after the leader who had quit or retired. But Turkey is pushing. There's been a lot of reports. They're going to move into northeast Syria. They want to take out the Kurds. The United States, no, you can't do that. Excuse me. And so what we have is a situation where Turkey is being pushed more and more into a relationship with Russia. And this all seems to fit into this Ezekiel 38 scenario. Here is a safe zone that they've proposed. Apparently, the United States and Turkey have agreed that there would be a safe zone. Syrian troops would not be allowed in that zone. No troops would be allowed in that zone. What Turkey really wants is they want to extend their border south. I've shown you maps that Erdogan had put out a couple of years ago, 3-4 years ago, where he took over all the way down to Mosul and south of Mosul in Iraq, because he considered that part of Turkey. Now, that's an oil-rich area. That's where a lot of the oil, the Kurdish region is rich in oil. And so he wants that area. To give you some idea, though, that safe zone area, while it says it's 32 kilometers and it's about 20 miles wide, it goes for several hundred miles along the Syrian-Turkish border. It is bigger than Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights combined. So it's a pretty significant sized area. So Turkey is saying, and here's a little speech that Erdogan gave talking about how they have these plans for deployment in that area, and the United States has reached this operation. So I want to do two things and I'll be finished. Jason Greenblatt, who's the chief envoy, or one of them for the president to try to resolve this, was criticized. I played you his speech from the UN last week or the week before, where he just said, listen, we're trying something different in this area. And we're trying a different way. And so the German ambassador came out and said, well, the United States is against the international consensus. And he gave an interview the other day during which he was questioned about, what do you think about what the German ambassador said? And here's a little bit of that interview. Whoops, hang on a second.
What it was that the German...
Okay, let me back up. I forgot I had my summit.
Good evening, Jason, and thank you for coming on. I read and reread your speech several times to see what it was that the German ambassador and others sought to criticize in it, and I can't, frankly, find anything there that seems to justify it. So could you tell us or give us a hint about what it is that you think was motivating it? Is it jealousy on their part? Is it an attempt to try and make themselves relevant? And secondly, how will the administration in the future phase stimulate the discussion about the specific issues that have come up in your mediation efforts?
Sure, thank you. First of all, it's great to be here with you both tonight. I was not surprised by the reaction to my speech at the Security Council, but the German ambassador in particular, he didn't just disagree with what we were saying. He went on the attack and completely distorted and mischaracterized my words. What we said at the United Nations was, number one, there is no international consensus on this conflict. People reflexively try to pretend that an international consensus exists as to how to resolve the conflict. That's not true. In fact, we couldn't even get an international consensus to condemn Hamas. Hamas is a terror organization that subjugates 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, vows to destroy Israel, shoots thousands of rockets at Israel. If there's no international consensus on that, there's no international consensus on a resolution here. People speak about how UN resolutions are a clear roadmap to resolve the conflict. They're not. They're aspirational. Maybe we can understand a little bit of how to resolve the conflict from the UN resolutions, but on this particular conflict, UN resolutions do not solve the equation. There are many things that I touched upon in the speech. I think it was new to the Security Council to hear that, and some of the criticism and pushback was appropriate, and some, like the German ambassador, was not.
Can I ask you what your...
You can find that article on Jason Greenblatt's Twitter feed. There was another murder in the West Bank area down near Gush Etzion this week near Hebron, and a young IDF soldier, yeshiva student, was stabbed to death. There was also an interesting, this is in Haaretz this week, and this article says that the French cut a secret deal with a Palestinian terror group in the 1980s, essentially saying, look, if you leave us alone, if you don't attack us, we don't care what else you do. We won't do anything to arrest you in France. So this is what France does. And I think that's maybe not so much the reason that they have a big problem now. There's consequences to those actions. Sometimes they take decades to come into play. This is the Waqf in Jerusalem. That's the organization that controls the Temple Mount area, is released this statement because there's sort of this convergence of the Muslim holiday that's spelled EID and Tish B'Av, which is being recognized, I think, today in Israel. The 9th of Av, the day the Jewish temples were destroyed, kind of are converging at the same time this year. So there was concerns that the Jews would go up on the Temple Mount, and so they closed all the mosques in Jerusalem except the ones on the Temple Mount, and they're trying to create this to prevent the Jews from going up there today. So it's a very tense situation. And here's what the Waqf said. They've decided to close all mosques in Jerusalem and establish a unified central Eid prayer in Al-Aqsa Mosque on Sunday to disrupt the intrusion of the settlers. So that's what is going on. There are reports about that. This is Tish B'Av. Here's a list in the Jerusalem Post of some of the things that have happened on Tish B'Av. The spies returned from the land of Israel with the report for Moses and the children of Israel before the war, the war that they had to take over Canaan. The destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, the expulsion of Jews from England in 1290 happened on Tish B'Av. The expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492 happened on Tish B'Av. World War I began on Tish B'Av. Treblinka death camp began operating, and the start of deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto happened on Tish B'Av in 1942. So it's a very important day on the Jewish calendar. The response to that, there's been some interesting things. There was a cistern discovered in the area of the Temple Mount that appears to be related to the first temple. Now, this has been known for a while. The information has just been released. I don't even have any photographs of it yet. But it shows that there was water storage there around the Temple Mount. The theory had long been that at the time of the first temple, the only water that was available for the temple and Jerusalem came from the Gihon Spring near the city, in the city of David. That's led to some people being the theory that, well, the temple had to be built over the Gihon Spring in the city of David. And that's a very popular theory now. I happen not to agree with it. As we were in Israel a couple years ago, we were shown aqueducts that came from Hebron all the way to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. You can still see remnants of them today, and they predate by many centuries the Romans, these ruins of these aqueducts. You can see them as you drive down to Hebron. So I believe the Temple Mount is where the temple was, and I know I have friends who disagree with me strongly. And my point always is, I'm not building that thing anyway. And the people who, almost everybody who's building it, like 99.99%, believe it was on the Temple Mount. And now they're discovering water cisterns around the Temple Mount. And they believe that there are more to be discovered. And these are quite large water cisterns. I think this one they found would hold 120,000 gallons. But this week, a couple things happened with regard to the building of the temple. One, they're practicing burning the red heifer. Now, the red heifer, you can read about that in Numbers chapter 19. I won't go into it, but it is a picture of the purity of the Messiah. I think sometimes people want to dismiss it. Well, that's Old Testament stuff. We don't need to worry about it. But all these things were pictures of the coming Messiah. And the red heifer was one. And they're practicing burning the red heifer. Again, this is part of these convergence of events, these things that happen that have not happened for thousands of years. And now they're happening now when you have Turkey, Iran, Russia on the northern border of Israel, you have world conflicts, you have all these things going on, and it becomes it just shows you that there is a convergence. So here is a video that was released this week by the Temple Institute called People Get Ready.
It will happen in the end of days. The mountain of the Temple of Hashem will be firmly established as the head of the mountains, and it will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it.
The verse that was cited in that video was Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it. Now that's, I believe, a messianic promise fulfilled in the millennial kingdom. But we know there is this desire for the temple. I don't have time to go into it. We'll talk more about it in the future. That temple, we know what will happen with that temple. But it's just another indication of one of these signs of things converging to indicate that the return of the Messiah is closer than ever. And so the message in that video was what? People get ready. So what I would say is it's time for the church to get ready, because we have things to do. That includes sharing the gospel with people and being bold in our faith, telling people that their only hope of salvation is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ and his finished, full, complete work on the cross, his perfect life, his death, burial, resurrection, and his soon return. And we need to be busy about that and ready for his return. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for your instruction. We pray that you will help us to be bold, effective witnesses for the truth of the gospel. In Jesus' name, amen.